"I'm downsizing your repository console," he announced, proud of himself. Those were the exact words Harrison Blake used when he fired me. 8 hours later, they erased my name from every server hardware map in the building. But at 2:03 a.m. that Tuesday morning, when the voltage converter cooling grid locked, and their $200 million server pool began its catastrophic meltdown, I became the security profile they couldn't erase. Welcome to Corporate Vault, where we uncover the real stories behind corporate power plays and technological disasters. If you're drawn to authentic tales of what really happens when boardroom decisions collide with technological reality, consider joining our growing community as we work toward our first milestone of 1,000 subscribers who appreciate these unfiltered investigations. My name is Owen Rodriguez, and for 12 years, I was the senior network security architect at TechNova Industries. I didn't grow up in Silicon Valley privilege or venture capital circles. My father fixed air conditioning units in San Antonio, working double shifts during Texas summers, while my mother spent her nights as a hospital technician. They taught me that every system, no matter how sophisticated, depends on real people making real decisions, and those people deserve respect. That lesson would become both my greatest strength and the reason I'd find myself in an impossible position when corporate efficiency collided with human reality. Let me take you back to where this all started. It was a Monday afternoon in May 2024 when Harrison Blake called me into his corner office. I'd been expecting this meeting. The rumors about cost-cutting had been circulating for weeks, and Blake's consulting team had been analyzing every department with surgical precision. "Owen," Blake said, not bothering to look up from his laptop, "I'm sure you've heard about our strategic realignment initiative." Strategic realignment. That's corporate speak for we're firing people to make the quarterly numbers look better. "I've heard the rumors," I replied, settling into the chair across from his desk. Blake finally looked at me, his expression that practiced combination of fake sympathy and business determination that executives perfect in leadership seminars. "Your position is being eliminated as part of our optimization efforts. We've determined that your responsibilities can be effectively distributed among the existing junior team members." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Harrison, with all due respect, I'm not sure you understand what that means for our security infrastructure." "Owen, I appreciate your dedication, but we have Kyle Morrison and 3 other talented engineers who can handle the day-to-day monitoring. Your salary represents a significant cost center, and frankly, we need to operate more efficiently." "It's not about day-to-day monitoring," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "The security protocols I've built here aren't just software running on servers. They're integrated into every aspect of our infrastructure. The thermal management alone." Blake raised his hand, cutting me off. "Owen, I understand you want to feel indispensable, but the reality is that technology has evolved. What required a senior architect 12 years ago can be managed by junior engineers today." I stared at him for a moment, realizing that no amount of explanation would change his mind. Blake saw everything through spreadsheets and cost analysis. To him, I was just an expensive line item that could be replaced with cheaper alternatives. "When does this take effect?" I asked. "We're offering you a generous severance package and 2 weeks to transition your responsibilities to Kyle's team. You'll find the terms quite fair." 2 weeks. 12 years of building one of the most sophisticated security architectures in Silicon Valley, and they were giving me 2 weeks to transfer knowledge that had taken over a decade to develop. That evening, I went home and told my wife Alina about the meeting. She was furious, not just about the job loss, but about the casual disrespect Blake had shown for my years of service. "They have no idea what they're doing," she said, pacing around our kitchen. "You've saved that company millions of dollars over the years, prevented countless security breaches, and this is how they treat you." "It's just business," I said, though I didn't really believe it. "Blake's under pressure to cut costs, and senior salaries are an easy target." "It's not just business when they're putting their entire infrastructure at risk." She was right, but there wasn't much I could do about it. The decision had been made, and I needed to focus on transitioning my responsibilities as professionally as possible. The next morning, I met with Kyle Morrison and the rest of the security team. Kyle was brilliant, an MIT graduate with impressive credentials and genuine enthusiasm for cybersecurity. But as we began going through my systems, I could see the overwhelming complexity starting to register on his face. "Owen," Kyle said, staring at a network diagram that covered an entire wall of my office. "This is more complicated than I expected." "That's because it's not just monitoring software," I explained. "It's a living ecosystem. Every protocol is designed to complement and support the others. Change one element and you affect the entire system." Kyle nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "How long do you think it'll take me to fully understand all of this?" I looked at the diagrams, the documentation, the years of institutional knowledge embedded in every decision I'd made. "Kyle, I've been building this for 12 years. Some of this knowledge. It's not just in the documentation. It's in understanding why certain decisions were made, what problems we were solving, how different systems interact under stress." "But you'll document everything, right?" "I'll document what I can," I said. "But there are aspects of this work that require intuition, pattern recognition, experience with how systems behave during crisis situations. That's not something you can just write down in a manual." Kyle spent the next few days shadowing me, watching how I analyzed threat patterns, monitored system performance, and made real-time adjustments to security protocols. He was a quick learner, but I could see him struggling to understand not just what I was doing, but why I was making specific decisions. "How do you know when a temperature spike is dangerous versus just a normal fluctuation?" he asked during one of our sessions. "Experience," I said. 12 years of watching these systems, understanding how they behave under different conditions, recognizing patterns that indicate developing problems before they become critical. But there must be specific criteria, measurable thresholds." "There are," I said, "but the real skill is knowing when to trust those thresholds and when to dig deeper because something doesn't feel right." Kyle looked frustrated. "That's not very scientific." "Kyle, technology isn't just science. It's art, intuition, and a lot of experience with how things go wrong." By the end of my first week, it was clear that transferring my knowledge wouldn't be as straightforward as Blake had assumed. Kyle was working 12-hour days just trying to understand the basic architecture, let alone the subtle interdependencies that made everything work together. On Friday afternoon, Blake attended one of our transition meetings, clearly impatient with the extended timeline. "Owen," he said, "I understood this would be a straightforward handoff of responsibilities. Kyle seems capable and your documentation appears comprehensive. Why is this taking so long?" I looked at Kyle, who was staring at his laptop screen with the expression of someone drowning in complexity. "Harrison, security architecture isn't like handing over a set of keys. Kyle is learning systems that took me years to develop and refine. But the basic monitoring functions should be transferable immediately." "The basic functions, yes. But what happens when something goes wrong, when systems start behaving unexpectedly, when we need to make real-time decisions about security protocols during a crisis?" Blake's jaw tightened. "Owen, I get the impression you're trying to make this more complicated than it needs to be, almost like you're trying to prove how indispensable you are." The accusation stung because it was so fundamentally wrong. I wasn't trying to protect my job. Blake had already made that impossible. I was trying to protect the company and its clients from the consequences of his short-sighted decision. "Harrison, I'm trying to ensure that TechNova's security doesn't collapse the moment I walk out that door." "Well, you have one more week to make sure that doesn't happen." After Blake left, Kyle and I sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment. "Owen," Kyle said finally, "I have to ask, do you really think I can handle this?" I looked at this brilliant young engineer who was being asked to take on responsibilities that had taken me over a decade to master. "Kyle, you're smart enough to handle anything, but you're being set up for failure, and that's not your fault." "What do you mean?" "You're being asked to maintain systems without understanding their history, to make decisions without context, to handle emergencies without experience. That's not a technology problem, that's a management problem." Kyle was quiet for a moment. "What would you do if you were me?" "Document everything you don't understand. When something doesn't make sense, ask questions. When you're not sure about a decision, be conservative. And Kyle," I paused, choosing my words carefully, "if something goes seriously wrong, don't let pride or company politics stop you from asking for help." The following Monday was supposed to be my last day. Blake had scheduled a company-wide presentation where I was expected to publicly endorse the transition and reassure clients that TechNova's security would continue seamlessly. Standing in that conference room, looking out at colleagues I'd worked with for 12 years and clients who trusted their most sensitive data to systems I'd built, I faced an impossible choice. Blake introduced me with corporate enthusiasm. Owen has done an exceptional job transitioning his responsibilities to our talented team, and I'm confident that our security capabilities will continue to exceed client expectations. All eyes turned to me. I could provide the reassurance Blake wanted, knowing that critical vulnerabilities remained unaddressed. Or I could speak honestly about the risks, potentially damaging client confidence while undermining Kyle's chances of success. "Thank you, Harrison," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Kyle and the team have worked incredibly hard this week to understand the systems we've built here. They're talented engineers with strong technical capabilities." I paused, looking directly at Blake. "I want to emphasize that security is not a set-it-and-forget-it operation. It requires ongoing attention, continuous learning, and the wisdom to know when to escalate issues that might seem routine but could indicate larger problems." Blake's expression darkened slightly, but I continued. "The protocols we've developed here have multiple layers of protection, but they work best when managed by people who understand not just how to follow procedures, but when to adapt those procedures to unexpected situations." After the meeting, Blake cornered me in the hallway. "Owen, that wasn't exactly the endorsement I was expecting." I told the truth, Harrison. Kyle and his team are capable, but they need time and support to fully master these systems. "Well, they're going to have to learn quickly, because your access is being revoked today instead of Friday." "What?" "I think a clean break is better than prolonging this transition. Your keycards will be deactivated at 6 p.m., and it will disable your system access immediately." I stared at him, realizing that Blake saw my measured comments as a form of sabotage. "Harrison, cutting off the transition early is dangerous. Kyle still has questions about emergency procedures." "Kyle will figure it out. He's smart, he's motivated, and he doesn't have the luxury of overthinking every decision." That evening, I cleaned out my desk while Kyle watched nervously from across the office. "Owen, what if something goes wrong and I can't reach you?" "Kyle, officially, I don't work here anymore as of—" I looked at my watch. 23 minutes ago, Blake made his position very clear. "But unofficially—" I handed Kyle my business card. "If there's a genuine emergency, and I mean genuine emergency, not just a confusing alert or an unfamiliar error message, you can call me. But understand that I can't access company systems, I can't see monitoring data, and I can't fix anything remotely." "I understand." "Kyle, one more thing. Blake is going to be under pressure to prove that this transition was successful. Don't let that pressure push you into making decisions you're not confident about. Better to seem overcautious than to create a real crisis." I walked out of TechNova that night knowing I'd done everything possible to prepare Kyle for what was coming. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Blake had made a catastrophic miscalculation about the true nature of the systems I'd built and the knowledge required to maintain them. Segment 3, 4923 characters. The weekend passed quietly. I spent Saturday morning interviewing with Pinnacle Financial Services, and the conversation went better than expected. The hiring manager, Janet Walsh, seemed genuinely impressed with my background and approach to security architecture. "Owen," she said as we wrapped up the interview, "your experience with large-scale infrastructure security is exactly what we need. We're migrating our entire cloud platform, and we need someone who understands both the technical and human elements of security management." "I appreciate that," I said. "Too many organizations treat security as a purely technical problem, but the human factors are just as critical." That's refreshingly realistic. Most candidates focus exclusively on technology and ignore the operational complexities. For the first time since Blake's announcement, I felt optimistic about the future. There were companies that valued experience and understood the difference between having security procedures and having people who could effectively implement those procedures under pressure. Saturday evening, Alina and I went out for dinner to celebrate what felt like the end of a difficult chapter and the beginning of something better. "You seem more relaxed than you've been in months," Elena observed. It's strange, I said. For the first time in 12 years, I'm not worried about TechNova's infrastructure. That's not my responsibility anymore. How does that feel? Liberating and terrifying at the same time. Sunday passed peacefully. I spent the morning working in our garden while Elena caught up on reading. For the first time in years, I wasn't checking my phone every few minutes for security alerts or system notifications. It felt like I was rediscovering what weekends were supposed to be like. But old habits die hard. Sunday evening, I found myself checking industry security feeds and threat intelligence reports, partly from professional curiosity and partly from lingering concern about the systems I'd built. Monday morning brought renewed energy as I prepared for another round of interviews. The job market was responding well to my applications, and I had 3 promising opportunities lined up for the week. At TechNova, Kyle arrived early, determined to start the week with confidence. He'd spent Sunday evening reviewing my documentation and felt ready to handle whatever routine issues might arise. But when Kyle logged into his monitoring console Monday morning, he discovered that the weekend hadn't been as quiet as everyone had assumed. "What the hell?" Kyle muttered, staring at temperature readings that showed concerning patterns throughout the data center. The thermal monitoring system was displaying intermittent spikes in several server clusters, spikes that hadn't been visible during Friday's normal business hours. Kyle immediately contacted the facilities team to investigate. "Hey, this is Kyle in security," he said when the facilities manager answered. "I'm seeing some unusual temperature readings from the weekend. Can you do a manual check of data center conditions?" "Sure thing," came the reply. "Give me 10 minutes. 10 minutes later, Kyle's phone rang. "Kyle, this is weird. Our manual readings show everything normal temperatures are well within acceptable ranges, but your monitoring system is showing spikes." Kyle felt his first flutter of genuine concern. "Yeah, intermittent spikes in clusters 7 through 12. The readings don't make sense if your manual measurements are normal." "Could be a sensor problem. Want me to check the monitoring hardware?" "Please." Kyle spent the morning troubleshooting what appeared to be a monitoring system glitch rather than actual temperature problems. But as he dug deeper into the diagnostic data, he realized that some of the monitoring protocols referenced in my documentation required administrative access levels that hadn't been properly transferred to him. When Kyle contacted TechNova's IT department about expanding his system privileges, he hit the first real bureaucratic obstacle of his new role. "Kyle, we need formal approval from Harrison Blake for that level of administrative access," the IT manager explained. "Those are high-level security permissions." But Owen's documentation specifically says these diagnostic tools are essential for thermal monitoring. "I understand, but we have policies about administrative access. Submit the request through proper channels, and we'll process it as quickly as possible." Kyle hung up feeling frustrated and slightly panicked. He was seeing monitoring anomalies that he couldn't properly investigate due to access restrictions that should have been resolved during the transition period. Tuesday brought worse news. The temperature anomalies were becoming more frequent and were appearing in additional server clusters. Kyle's requests for expanded administrative access were working their way through TechNova's approval bureaucracy, but the process was moving slowly. More concerning, Kyle noticed that server performance metrics were beginning to show subtle degradation response times that were slightly longer than normal, processing loads that seemed less efficient than they should be. "Blake's office," the executive assistant answered when Kyle called. "This is Kyle Morrison in security. I need to speak with Harrison about some urgent system issues." "Mr. Blake is in budget meetings all day. Can this wait until tomorrow?" Kyle looked at his monitoring screens, which showed increasing numbers of amber warnings across the thermal management system. "It's about potential infrastructure problems. I think it's important. I can schedule you for 15 minutes at 4:30 this afternoon." When Kyle finally got his meeting with Blake, he tried to explain the situation as clearly as possible. "Harrison, we have monitoring anomalies that suggest developing thermal stress in multiple server clusters. I need expanded administrative access to run proper diagnostics, but it says that requires your approval." Blake barely looked up from his laptop. Kyle, is this an immediate crisis or a potential problem? It's somewhere in between. The monitoring systems are showing patterns that Owen's documentation says could indicate serious developing issues. Could indicate, so nothing's actually failing right now. No, but... Kyle, I need you to understand something. We eliminated Owen's position because we were confident you could handle these responsibilities. Part of that means learning to distinguish between real problems and false alarms. Kyle felt heat rising in his cheeks. I understand that, but I'm trying to be proactive about potential issues. Which I appreciate, but I can't approve expanded administrative access every time you see an unfamiliar alert. Figure out solutions using the tools you have available. Walking back to his office, Kyle realized that Blake's pressure to demonstrate independence was creating exactly the kind of dangerous situation I had warned about. By Wednesday morning, Kyle was working 18-hour days trying to resolve the thermal monitoring issues using limited diagnostic tools. He'd contacted external vendors, researched similar problems in technical forums, and even reached out to former colleagues at other companies. What Kyle discovered was that TechNova's thermal management systems were more sophisticated and customized than typical data center implementations. The monitoring protocols I developed included proprietary integrations that weren't documented in standard industry resources. Owen really built something unique here, Kyle muttered to himself, as he tried to decode error logs that referenced custom protocols he couldn't find documentation for. Wednesday afternoon brought Kyle the administrative access he'd been requesting, but the diagnostic results revealed a more complex problem than he'd anticipated. The thermal monitoring communication errors weren't random hardware glitches. They were systematic failures in the integration between my security protocols and recently updated cooling controller firmware. Kyle realized he was dealing with compatibility issues that my documentation addressed only in general terms. The specific configuration changes needed to resolve this particular problem weren't detailed in any written procedures. That evening, Kyle called his mentor from MIT, Professor Angela Martinez, hoping for guidance. Angela, I'm in over my head here, Kyle admitted. I've inherited responsibility for security systems that are incredibly sophisticated, but the person who built them was terminated before I could properly learn how everything works together. Kyle, that sounds like a management failure, not a technical problem. Are you getting support from your company? My CEO wants me to figure everything out independently to prove that the transition was successful. But these systems, they're not just code running on servers. They're integrated into every aspect of our infrastructure in ways that require institutional knowledge I don't have. What would happen if you contacted the previous architect directly? Kyle was quiet for a moment. I think my CEO would see that as admitting failure. Kyle, there's a difference between admitting failure and recognizing when you need help. If this infrastructure is as critical as you're describing, pride shouldn't be the deciding factor. Thursday morning, Kyle made significant progress reconfiguring the thermal monitoring systems to work with the updated cooling controllers. His solutions were technically competent and seemed to address the immediate compatibility issues. By Thursday afternoon, the monitoring systems appeared to be functioning normally. Server temperatures had stabilized, and the performance metrics that had been concerning Kyle earlier in the week were returning to acceptable ranges. Blake was pleased with Kyle's apparent success and used it as validation of his decision to eliminate my position. Kyle solved the thermal monitoring issues completely independently, Blake announced during Thursday's executive staff meeting. This demonstrates that our security transition was successful and that we can operate efficiently with our current team structure. But Kyle had a nagging feeling that his solutions, while technically sound for the immediate problem, had changed the fundamental architecture of systems he didn't fully understand. He'd focused on resolving the communication errors, without fully comprehending how those protocols integrated with other security measures. Thursday evening, Kyle stayed late to document the changes he'd made, hoping to create the kind of comprehensive records that would help him remember his reasoning if similar issues arose in the future. As he was writing up his modifications, Kyle noticed references in my original documentation to predictive thermal management protocols and long-term pattern analysis systems. These seemed to be related to the systems he'd just reconfigured, but Kyle couldn't find detailed documentation about what those protocols actually did. Kyle made a note to investigate those references when he had more time, but the immediate crisis seemed resolved, and Blake was expecting him to focus on other security priorities. Friday passed quietly, with all monitoring systems showing normal operations. Kyle began to feel genuinely confident that he had successfully navigated his first major crisis as TechNova's lead security engineer. "How are things going?" Blake asked when he encountered Kyle in the hallway Friday afternoon. "Much better," Kyle replied. "The thermal monitoring issues are resolved and everything's operating normally." "Excellent, I knew you'd figure it out." But as Friday evening approached, Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important about the systems he'd modified. My documentation was comprehensive about procedures and protocols, but it didn't explain the philosophy behind the design decisions or the potential consequences of changing those design patterns. Kyle decided to spend the weekend reviewing my documentation more carefully, looking for clues about the deeper architecture he might have inadvertently affected with his modifications. What Kyle didn't realize was that my thermal management systems operated on multiple timescales. The immediate monitoring protocols he'd successfully repaired were just the surface layer of a more sophisticated architecture that included predictive algorithms analyzing long-term patterns and gradual changes that might not become visible for days or weeks. Kyle's modifications had resolved the immediate communication problems, but they had also disabled some of the deeper protective mechanisms that operated on extended timeframes, mechanisms that might not activate unless truly catastrophic conditions developed. Saturday and Sunday passed quietly, with Kyle spending considerable time trying to fully understand the systems he was now responsible for maintaining. He was beginning to appreciate the depth and sophistication of the architecture I'd built, but he was also becoming aware of how much he still didn't understand about why certain decisions had been made. Sunday evening marked exactly 1 week since my access had been revoked. As if the infrastructure itself was marking the anniversary, subtle changes began developing throughout TechNova's data center, changes that Kyle's modified monitoring systems weren't designed to detect. The server load balancing algorithms started making suboptimal decisions as their thermal models became less accurate without my comprehensive monitoring data. Cooling systems worked harder to compensate for thermal loads they couldn't properly predict. Power consumption increased gradually, but measurably, as hardware operated outside optimal efficiency ranges. By midnight Sunday, multiple systems were operating at the edge of their design parameters, but Kyle's monitoring console showed everything as normal. The early warning systems that might have alerted me to developing problems had been casualties of Kyle's well-intentioned compatibility fixes. Monday morning started like any other day. I had an interview scheduled with Quantum Industries at 10 a.m., and I was feeling optimistic about my prospects. Elena made coffee while I reviewed my notes about their cloud security challenges. "You seem more relaxed about this whole job search," Elena observed. "I think I'm finally processing that getting fired might actually be the best thing that could have happened," I said. "These companies I'm interviewing with actually value experience and institutional knowledge." At 2:03 a.m. Tuesday morning, my phone started ringing. I ignored it initially. After 12 years of being TechNova's emergency contact, I'd been looking forward to sleeping through the night without worrying about infrastructure alerts. But the phone kept ringing. The caller ID showed TechNova's main number. My first instinct was to let it go to voicemail. Whatever crisis they were facing was no longer my responsibility. But 12 years of being the person others called during emergencies made it impossible to ignore. "Owen, thank God you answered." Kyle's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "We have a massive thermal failure and I can't get any of your emergency protocols to work properly." I sat up in bed, my mind immediately shifting into crisis management mode. "Kyle, what's the situation?" "The voltage converter cooling grid locked up about 20 minutes ago. We're losing server capacity across the entire data center. Emergency shutdowns are cascading through multiple clusters, and I can't stop it." "How much capacity have you lost?" "About 60% and climbing." "Owen, I've been trying to follow your emergency response procedures, but half the systems they reference don't exist anymore. I think my modifications from last week changed things in ways I didn't understand. I felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders, the feeling I'd carried for 12 years of being the person who had to solve problems when everything went wrong. Kyle, I need you to understand something, I said, choosing my words carefully. I don't work for TechNova anymore. Blake made that very clear when he cut my transition short and revoked my access. I know, and I'm sorry about how that happened. But Owen, we have client data at risk, and I don't know how to bring the systems back online safely. I can't reach the emergency response protocols. The diagnostic tools aren't working the way your documentation says they should, and Blake is on his way in. He's going to want answers I don't have. I looked at the clock, 2:47 a.m. In my mind, I could see exactly what was happening at TechNova's data center, the cascade of thermal failures, the emergency shutdown protocols activating in sequence, the gradual collapse of systems I'd spent 12 years building to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophic failure. Kyle, I'll help you, but I need you to understand that I'm doing this as a professional courtesy, not as a TechNova employee. And this conversation needs to be documented properly. Whatever you need, just please help me figure out how to stop this. First, I need you to tell me exactly what modifications you made to the thermal monitoring systems last week. For the next 20 minutes, Kyle walked me through his changes, and I began to understand what had gone wrong. Kyle's solutions had been technically competent for the immediate compatibility issues, but they had inadvertently disabled the predictive monitoring systems that prevented thermal overload conditions from developing. Kyle, your modifications fixed the communication errors, but they also removed the early warning systems that would have prevented this cascade failure. What do you mean? The thermal monitoring protocols I built weren't just about measuring current temperatures. They analyzed patterns, predicted thermal stress before it became critical, and prevented server operations that would create dangerous conditions. But the documentation didn't explain that. Because that knowledge was supposed to be transferred during the transition period that Blake cut short. Kyle, can you access the emergency response console? I'm trying, but it's asking for authentication that I don't have. I guided Kyle through emergency procedures that weren't documented anywhere, because they required real-time assessment of system conditions and adaptive problem-solving. Working remotely, I helped him understand how to read thermal patterns that indicated underlying hardware stress, how to distinguish between temporary spikes that could be safely ignored and sustained problems that required immediate attention. Owen, how do I know which server clusters can be safely restarted? Look at the thermal recovery patterns in zones 4 through 8. Are you seeing gradual temperature decline or erratic fluctuations? Gradual decline in zones 4, 6, and 7. Erratic in zones 5 and 8. Good, you can restart zones 4, 6, and 7, but zones 5 and 8 need additional cooling before they can handle normal loads. By 4:15 a.m., we had managed to bring about 40% of server capacity back online, enough to restore critical client services while we continued working on the remaining systems. At 4:30 a.m., Blake arrived at the office and found Kyle working with me via phone and video conference to systematically restart server clusters using procedures that weren't documented in any of TechNova's official emergency response materials. Blake's face when he realized that Kyle was working with me to resolve the crisis was a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and grudging recognition that his assumptions about the transferability of my knowledge had been fundamentally wrong. Kyle, Blake said, "What's the status?" "We've restored about 40% of capacity, and we're working on bringing the rest back online safely. But Harrison, I need to be direct with you. Without Owen's guidance, this situation could have resulted in permanent hardware damage and data loss." Blake looked at me on Kyle's laptop screen. "Owen, I appreciate your assistance with this situation. Harrison, this crisis was completely preventable. The thermal failure happened because Kyle's modifications last week disabled protective protocols that were specifically designed to prevent cascade failures. I thought Kyle had successfully resolved those monitoring issues. Kyle resolved the immediate compatibility problems, But he didn't have the institutional knowledge to understand how those changes would affect the broader security architecture. That's not Kyle's fault. That's a failure of transition planning. By 6 a.m., we had restored 75% of server capacity, enough to resume normal client operations, while we continued working on the remaining thermal management issues. But the crisis had revealed fundamental problems with the way TechNova was managing critical infrastructure after my departure. As I ended the call at 6:15 a.m., having spent over 3 hours helping TechNova recover from a crisis they were no longer paying me to solve, I realized that Blake's cost-cutting measures had created exactly the kind of catastrophic failure I'd spent 12 years trying to prevent. Later Monday morning, I received a call that I'd been half expecting since helping Kyle resolve the thermal crisis. "Owen, this is Harrison Blake. I think we need to talk." "I figured we might," I replied, settling into my home office chair. "First, I want to thank you for helping us through the situation this morning. Kyle tells me that your guidance was essential in preventing permanent equipment damage. Harrison, that crisis shouldn't have happened in the first place." Blake was quiet for a moment. "I'm beginning to understand that. Owen, we've received some concerning feedback from clients about this morning's outages. Meridian Financial is requesting an emergency meeting, and they specifically want you to participate." "They want me to participate?" "Their CTO, Robert Hayes, conducted his own investigation into the incident. He's figured out that you were instrumental in resolving the crisis despite no longer being employed here. He's questioning whether our cost-cutting measures have compromised our ability to maintain reliable service." I had to give Hayes credit for thoroughness. Meridian was TechNova's largest client, and Hayes had a reputation for not accepting corporate spin when it came to infrastructure reliability. "What exactly are you asking me, Harrison?" "I'd like to discuss the possibility of you returning to TechNova, either as an employee or as a consultant. We clearly need your expertise to ensure that incidents like this morning don't happen again." The conversation I'd been hoping I'd never have to have. Blake was essentially admitting that his decision to terminate my employment had been a mistake, but he was trying to frame my potential return as a mutually beneficial business opportunity rather than an acknowledgement of his poor judgment. "Harrison, I need to be completely honest with you. I've spent the last week interviewing with other companies, and I've received several attractive offers. Companies that understand the value of institutional knowledge and experience." "I understand that. What would it take to bring you back?" I thought about the thermal crisis that morning, about Kyle's struggle to maintain systems he didn't fully understand, about the clients whose data had been at risk because Blake had prioritized short-term cost savings over operational stability. First, I'd want to come back as an independent consultant, not as an employee. I want autonomy over security architecture decisions and the authority to implement changes without bureaucratic approval processes. That's possible. Second, Kyle and I need to work together on a proper knowledge transfer that could take months, not weeks. He's a talented engineer, but he needs time and support to fully understand these systems. Agreed. Third, compensation that reflects my actual value to TechNova's operations, not what someone with my job title typically earns. Blake was quiet for a moment. "Owen, I think we can work something out. When could you start?" "I haven't agreed to anything yet," I said. "I need to think about whether I want to work for a company that treated me the way TechNova did." "I understand. But Owen, I hope you'll consider it. We clearly made mistakes in how we handled your departure, and we'd like the opportunity to make things right." After ending the call with Blake, I sat in my office thinking about the choices ahead of me. The other companies I'd been interviewing with offered interesting opportunities and professional environments that valued experience and expertise. Returning to TechNova would mean working for a CEO who had demonstrated poor judgment about critical infrastructure decisions. But I also thought about Kyle, who was struggling to maintain systems he didn't fully understand. I thought about TechNova's clients, whose data and services depended on infrastructure that needed experienced oversight. I thought about the colleagues I'd worked with for 12 years, many of whom weren't responsible for Blake's short-sighted decisions. Elena found me in my office an hour later, still staring out the window. "That was Blake, wasn't it?" she said. "How did you know?" "You have that expression you get when you're trying to solve an impossible problem. I told her about Blake's offer, and about the choice I was facing between returning to TechNova and pursuing opportunities with companies that had never treated me as expendable. "What does your gut tell you?" Elena asked. "That Blake hasn't learned anything from this experience. He's asking me to come back because he needs me, not because he respects what I do." But Kyle is a good guy who's been put in an impossible situation, and there are clients and colleagues who depend on those systems working properly. Elena nodded. "So this isn't really about Blake or even about TechNova. It's about the people who get hurt when critical systems fail." She was right, as usual. This wasn't about my relationship with Blake or my feelings about being fired. It was about professional responsibility and ensuring that critical infrastructure remained secure and reliable. That evening, I called Blake back. "Harrison, I'll come back as a consultant under the conditions we discussed. But I need you to understand that this isn't about forgiveness or putting the past behind us. This is about ensuring that TechNova's infrastructure doesn't fail and put people at risk." "I understand," Blake said. "When can you start?" "Tomorrow morning. But Harrison, if you ever make infrastructure decisions based purely on cost considerations without understanding the technical implications, I'll walk away permanently." "Agreed." The next morning, I walked back into TechNova as a consultant, not as an employee. Kyle was waiting in my former office with relief written all over his face. "Owen, I can't tell you how glad I am that you're back." "Kyle, we have a lot of work to do," I said. "But first, I need you to understand that this situation wasn't your fault. You were asked to take on responsibilities that should have required months of transition planning, and you were given inadequate support and resources." I felt like I was failing every day. "You weren't failing. You were succeeding at an impossible task. But now we're going to make sure you have everything you need to maintain these systems properly." Over the following weeks, Kyle and I worked together to restore and improve the thermal management protocols that had been affected by his earlier modifications. We also developed hybrid solutions that incorporated Kyle's fresh perspective with my institutional knowledge, creating systems that were more robust than either of us could have built alone. Most importantly, we established proper knowledge transfer processes that would prevent future crises if I ever left TechNova again. The meeting with Meridian Financial Services took place the following week in TechNova's main conference room. Robert Hayes attended virtually, along with several other members of Meridian's technical team. Blake, Kyle, and I represented TechNova, with me participating as the senior security consultant who had helped resolve the recent crisis. Hayes didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Owen, we understand you were terminated by TechNova last week, but were called back to help resolve a major infrastructure failure. Can you explain what happened?" I chose my words carefully. TechNova attempted to transition security responsibilities to junior team members without adequate knowledge transfer time. When compatibility issues arose with thermal monitoring systems, the modifications made to resolve those issues inadvertently disabled protective protocols that prevented cascade failures. "And these protective protocols were your design?" "Yes, they were integrated into TechNova's infrastructure over a 12-year period and required institutional knowledge that couldn't be easily documented or transferred." Hayes looked directly at Blake through the video connection. "Mr. Blake, help me understand how you eliminated the position of someone who appears to be essential to your infrastructure operations." Blake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We made assumptions about the transferability of technical knowledge that proved to be incorrect. We've since brought Owen back as a senior consultant and implemented new procedures to ensure proper knowledge management for critical positions." "Owen," Hayes continued, "in your professional opinion, are the security vulnerabilities that led to this incident fully resolved?" "The immediate technical issues have been addressed," I said. "Kyle and I have restored and improved the affected protocols. More importantly, we've established proper knowledge transfer processes and redundant expertise to prevent similar incidents." But the underlying management approach that created this situation hasn't fundamentally changed. TechNova eliminated critical institutional knowledge to achieve short-term cost savings without understanding the operational risks. Hayes nodded. "That's our concern as well. Mr. Blake, what assurances can you provide that similar cost-cutting measures won't compromise infrastructure reliability in the future? Blake spent the next 20 minutes explaining new policies and procedures for evaluating the impact of personnel decisions on operational capabilities. He outlined expanded training programs, knowledge documentation requirements, and succession planning processes that would prevent critical expertise from being lost during future transitions. Hayes listened patiently, then asked the question Blake had been dreading. And what happens if Owen decides to leave TechNova again? Are these new processes sufficient to maintain security without his involvement? Kyle spoke up for the first time. Mr. Hayes, I'm confident that with proper time and support, our team can maintain these systems effectively. But that requires understanding that security architecture isn't just technical documentation. It's accumulated experience and judgment that takes time to develop. Hayes seemed satisfied with Kyle's honesty. Owen, what's your assessment of TechNova's current security capabilities? With the changes we've made over the past month, TechNova's security architecture is stronger than it was before the incident. Kyle and his team now understand the systems more deeply, and we've built in additional redundancy to prevent single points of failure. And if you were to leave again, the transition would be managed properly this time, with adequate knowledge transfer and ongoing support during the adjustment period. Hayes concluded the meeting by expressing cautious confidence in TechNova's ability to maintain service reliability, but he made it clear that Meridian would be monitoring their infrastructure performance more closely and expected regular updates on security system improvements. After the meeting, Blake and I had a private conversation in his office. Owen, I owe you an apology, Blake said. I made decisions about your position based on financial analysis without understanding the operational implications. That was poor leadership on my part. Harrison, the important thing is that we've prevented similar incidents and established processes to maintain institutional knowledge. But you need to understand that technology infrastructure isn't just a cost center. It's a strategic asset that requires experienced management. I'm learning that, Blake said. I've also learned that some decisions can't be made purely based on spreadsheet analysis. Over the following months, I continued as TechNova's senior security consultant, gradually transitioning responsibilities back to Kyle and other team members through carefully planned processes that emphasized understanding over documentation. When I finally left TechNova to pursue other opportunities, it was with confidence that the company's security systems would remain in capable hands. Kyle had developed into an excellent security architect, combining his technical skills with the institutional knowledge and practical experience necessary to manage complex systems effectively. The transition process had taught both of us valuable lessons about the importance of proper knowledge transfer and the risks of treating specialized expertise as easily replaceable. Blake's leadership survived the crisis, but the experience had fundamentally changed his approach to operational management. TechNova implemented new policies requiring detailed assessment of operational risks before making personnel decisions, and they established knowledge management processes to preserve institutional expertise. The incident became a case study within TechNova about the hidden costs of aggressive cost-cutting and the critical importance of understanding the human elements in complex technical systems. It served as a reminder that in the world of technology infrastructure, the most sophisticated systems are only as reliable as the people who understand and maintain them. Most importantly, the crisis had demonstrated that security isn't just about having the right procedures in place. It's about having people who possess the experience, judgment, and institutional knowledge to adapt those procedures to unexpected situations and make critical decisions when systems fail. Closing. Walking away from TechNova for the second time, I carried with me a deeper understanding of the delicate balance between technology and human expertise. The systems I'd built over 12 years weren't just code and hardware. They were the embodiment of accumulated knowledge, experience, and judgment that couldn't be easily replicated or replaced. Blake's initial decision to eliminate my position had been based on the assumption that technology expertise was a commodity that could be easily transferred or outsourced. The thermal crisis that followed demonstrated the fundamental flaw in that assumption, that complex systems require not just technical knowledge, but institutional wisdom and the ability to make critical decisions under pressure. If this story resonated with you and you're interested in more investigations into corporate decision-making and its real-world consequences, consider subscribing to Corporate Vault. Your support helps us continue exploring these untold stories from the intersection of business, technology, and human expertise. And we're working toward reaching our first milestone of 1,000 subscribers who value these in-depth analyses. The next time you hear about corporate restructuring or efficiency initiatives, remember my story and ask yourself, what institutional knowledge is walking out the door, and what are the true costs of treating human expertise as an expendable resource? In our rush to optimize and streamline, we sometimes forget that the most critical systems depend not just on technology, but on the accumulated wisdom of the people who build, maintain, and protect them.